Hi there, I'm Jen, this is Remembered Reads, and this is going to be a quick chat about Gabriel Wyner's Fluent Forever. This is a book that came out a couple of years ago, and it's been getting more buzz lately because the beta version of an app that's inspired by this has just come out. I had been seeing heavy advertising for this on social media, and I was curious to read more about it, so I grabbed the book out of the library, and I thought I'd chat a little bit about how this was. The author is an opera singer, which gives him an interesting background in that I think it's a profession where a lot of people learn the sound of language and the blocks of words before they learn to speak the language. So he goes into this with a recommendation that people start with sound, which I think is solid, because I think obviously that's how kids learn. You hear things before you understand them. Although I do take issue with some of the ways he suggests doing that, but we can talk about that separately. The great bulk of this, though, is about how to make cue cards, or how to use apps to make virtual cue cards, which is a pretty standard language learning tool. That is not new. The new element that I think he brings to it, or that he emphasizes in a way that isn't always emphasized, is to not have your native language or the language that you are stepping off from on the cards. So he is suggesting against the idea of having the language you're learning on one side and your native language on the other, so you can flip between them. His suggestion is if you want to learn the word dog, you have dog and then the picture of the dog. You don't have dog and then the word for dog on your native language on the back, which is a bit of a simplification because he has a fairly complicated way of letting you create sentences and teach yourself grammar that way, which is interesting. And I think if you're someone who learns well in that style, I think that's probably a great tip. I feel like that's a little bit unnatural, but I think a lot of that just depends on your learning style. Aside from that, I was surprised by how simple most of the tips in here are. This does suggest the obvious go through an immersion process, and he talks about immersion programs that he had done. He suggests sites like italki where you can meet up with people online. He has links mentioned in here that you can visit on his own page, where he will send you to different resources for different languages, both for immersion programs and also for checklists and making your own cards. My understanding is that the app is basically going to be cards being made for you instead of having to follow the rules in here of going through making cue cards. And I think if your goal is to create useful cue cards, I think this is probably a great guide. That would not be my choice for wanting to learn a language, so I wasn't as impressed by this as I don't know that I thought this was actually going to be anything revolutionary, because I think we know how to learn languages. It's just that most people are too lazy to go through the process, or are too shy to do a lot of talking, to make mistakes, and you need to make mistakes when they are in an immersion situation. So I think that's what holds people back, not that we don't know how to learn. There are a few things that I didn't particularly think were necessarily valid depending on learning styles. He, for example, suggests that you watch TV in your target language, but suggests not having the subtitles on. And by the subtitles, I don't mean having the subtitles in your native language and watching it. Although I do think that's a good way to pick up the sound of language before you have even started learning. But he is actually against having the closed captioning on in the language that you are learning at the same time, which I quite disagree with. I actually think that it's a great way to pick up terminology in a language when you have picked up the basic vocabulary, whether through an initial course or through, for example, his idea of taking the most used words in a language and learning all of those. I think that lets you separate things out in a way that not everyone can pick up. When you meet people who are learning languages, seem to be just as many people who have the listening part down before the speaking, and vice versa. I don't think there's one universal way, and I think for people who are challenged by the listening element, having the words on the screen is useful. I think it's useful to teach yourself to spell as well, assuming it's a alphabet-based language that you're learning. So I had a bit of a disagreement with that. He also has a list of suggested books for eventually you would be fluent enough to read books in the language, and he doesn't particularly talk about picture books, which I think was quite a loss. Especially if you look at child language learning, that is definitely something that adds to engagement with language. And When he suggests moving that later, the assumption is that you already have a certain amount of vocabulary. But by engaging with children's books, you're looking at, a lot of times, pictures alongside it, and it is the kind of thing that invites discussion. And this is the part where I think I might insert some video that I took when my sister and I were both visiting some family a while ago. And she picked up some kids' books. When you see a parent or a teacher reading to a child, they don't just read the story. Although obviously reading the story can be part of it. And I might insert some story here.
À la maison, tout à coup, ils entendirent un grondement par-dessous leur tête. Oh, sauterelle sautante, dit papa, c'est un avion. Et il semble que le pilote nous fait signe.
But in addition to that, you have a kind of back and forth. Because if the story is illustrated, the parent or teacher, again, can point to, this is the actor, this is the action that is happening, this is this animal or this uniform or this vehicle, all of that.
Der kleine gelbe Fisch hat gesagt, die Sonne ist rund und gelb und orange und wunderschön. Wenigstens einmal im Leben möchte ich die Sonne sehen. Die Seestern sagt, Kraken können niemals schwimmen, weil sie keine Flossen haben.
Again, I think storybooks reinforce that in a way that is more similar to his system of cue cards than not. So I was surprised that there wasn't much of that. And again, it invites discussion in the language itself, because one of the things that is suggested is, of course, you need practice. And some of practices, if you don't have someone to practice with, you can practice talking to yourself. And again, I think children's books are great for that, because you can look at a page, read the story, read the poem, read whatever, and then talk about it. Talk about the elements. And they're going to be fairly basic, because again, this is a children's story.
You have been to Medicine Hat? Check. And you have been to Moose Jaw? Check. But you have not yet been to Trois Rivières or Red Deer or Aklavik or Chrysler's Farm or Winnipeg or Napanee or the Gatineaus or Kamloops.
So I thought it was a shame that there wasn't as much focus on that, because personally I think the cue cards would be a bit dry. That said, so even though I disagree with the media elements, and I think the cue cards are either very useful or just sort of okay based on your particular learning style, I did think if you have never learned a language before, or if your only experience of language learning has been a very rudimentary course, which I think a lot of people don't get much out of a rudimentary course because they don't get anything to back it up. If they don't have anywhere to practice the language and they don't have any exposure to it outside of a textbook, I think this is very useful for that. I think if you're familiar with language learning in general, I don't think this is going to be anything new for you, but if you are looking to make exciting new cue cards, I think this is a good guide for that in particular. I sound a little more lukewarm about that than I actually was. I thought it was quite well done. I just don't think I'm particularly the target market for it, but I was curious. It sated my curiosity about what that's going to be like, and I will be curious to see the reviews for their app come in, because I do find all the different language learning apps like Duolingo and Babbel, etc. to be really fascinating. So I'd love to hear, if you have learned a language outside of school or family situations, what were your favorite methods for working on vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation? I'd love to hear what you think about that. I'd love to hear what your philosophy is for that and what's worked for you or not worked. Anyway, that's it for now. Ciao.